Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump says he will soon decide on weapons for Taiwan. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power as the summit with President Xi wraps up with an unprecedented conversation about Taiwan's independence and little to show in terms of deliverables. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Remarkable, Kailey, that President Xi directly asked President Trump if the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense.
Yeah, and the president said that he was uncommittal. Basically didn't answer him either way. It raises the question, what was committed to over this summit? Yes, Boeing planes, perhaps a couple hundred of them going to be bought by China. They're going to open the door again to beef coming from the United States, but not necessarily as many tangible deliverables in hand as the president makes his journey back to Washington as maybe some expected or hoped for as he headed off to the summit.
And now suddenly questions about whether a multi-billion-dollar weapons shipment to Taiwan is in fact supported by the president. It certainly is by congressional leaders on Capitol Hill. And when he comes home, this may be the next conversation that we have. All the while, big questions about the impact on the economy with an ongoing closed Strait of Hormuz. Kailey, that part hasn't changed, and the summit didn't seem to change the contours of our standoff with Iran. Oil prices are back up and interest rates are too.
Yeah, in a massive way. Huge selling pressure in the bond market today. Right now, we're up 11 basis points on the 10-year yield, just shy of 460 once again. Clearly a market that is growing increasingly concerned around persistent inflationary pressures and wondering what it's going to mean for monetary policy on what just so happens to be the very last day of Chairman Powell's term at the Federal Reserve. Of course, it's Kevin Warsh's challenge to inherit. It's a tough one.
Welcome to the party. By the way, does Jay Powell get a cake or something? Is there a handing of the gavel? Nothing formal on the schedule over there?
Maybe they could give him a cake in the shape of a hard hat.
That would be cool, I think.
That would be cool. We might have to arrange that. Hey, Charlie Pellet liked my joke. Charlie, let's check on the markets on this Friday. How you doing in New York?
I was thinking pretty much the same thing, but you beat me to it. Just kidding here, Kailey. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all very much in the red right now. We got a sell-off in global bonds. That has halted a rally in stocks. Concern today intensifying that central banks will be forced to tighten policy to keep inflation in check. So here's where we stand. S&P 500 index right now lower by 71, 74.29 where we stand. That is a drop of 1%. You recall yesterday trading at a record above 7,500, a retreat today. The Dow also pulling back, was above 50K, down now by 430 points, drop there of 0.9%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index down 326, a drop there of 1.2%. We've got the 10-year currently yielding 4.59%, the 2-year 4.08%, and the 30-year 5.11%. Keep it locked into Bloomberg for the very latest on these fast-moving markets. Spot gold down 101 the ounce now to 45.30, drop there just about 2.2%, while West Texas Intermediate crude, another concern for the market, WTI up 3.8%, 105 even a barrel right now, barrel of Brent just above 109, Brent crude up by 3.2%. Bitcoin back below 80K, Bitcoin at 79,233, Bitcoin down by 2.6%. Bill Ackman says Pershing Square has built a new stake in Microsoft, taking advantage of a decline in the company's share price to invest in a business that he says is stronger and more resilient than investors think. Microsoft shares on a down day for a lot of tech names, on a down day for much of the market. Microsoft up now by 3.7%. Briefly after earnings, we got Applied Materials down now by 0.6%. Just getting word from the Justice Department, it will seek the death penalty for Elias Rodriguez. He's accused of fatally shooting 2 Israeli embassy staff members in Washington. He will face federal hate, crime, and murder charges. Round 2 of the PGA Championship underway in Newtown in Pennsylvania. At last check, Japan's Hideki Matsuyama sits atop the leaderboard at 3 under par. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet checking on the markets and golf for us. I wonder if President Trump has the PGA Championship on the plane television
Absolutely,
on Air Force One on his way back from China. I would imagine so. It's a long flight. You got to entertain yourself somehow. In part, the president did that by speaking to the reporters on Air Force One as he journeys back from China about the trip after we heard him speaking next to Chinese President Xi Jinping in the last day of their summit together today, where we understand much was discussed, yet not as much formally committed to. But this is how President Trump has characterized things.
This has been an incredible visit. I think a lot of good has come of it. We've made some fantastic trade deals, great for both countries.
President Xi's an incredible guy. Got along, made a lot of great trade deals, including over 200 planes for Boeing with a promise of 750 planes. We didn't discuss tariffs. I mean, they're paying tariffs. They're paying substantial tariffs.
But they, of course, did not talk about tariffs and any number of other issues, according to the Chinese. And there's a bit of a back and forth on what exactly was said because the readouts don't completely align. There was a deal, as Kailey mentioned, to sell 200 Boeing jets. There does not seem to be a purchase requirement or guarantee, whether it's jets or beef. Also, beef imports resumed. So the news seems to be surrounding Taiwan and the conversation that these two world leaders had, which is where we start with Tyler Kendall. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent is still on the ground in Beijing, picking up the pieces after this 3-day summit. Tyler, will Taiwan be the takeaway?
At this point, Joe, it definitely was the largest point of contention. And in fact, just breaking in the last few moments, we're getting a statement from Taiwan, apparently in response to President Trump being a non-committal about that $14 billion weapons package that is queued up for his approval. Taiwan's Foreign Affairs Ministry reportedly saying, in part, quote, regarding arms sales to Taiwan, this is not only a security commitment to Taiwan, but also a joint deterrent against regional threats. This definitely dominated the conversation and did threaten to derail the mood here in Beijing, which was rather cordial, if you will, considering that both sides had said that they were going to prioritize stability. And I think that's the other big takeaway from the meeting that happened here in Beijing, which is that the dialogue is going to continue. The two sides were stable enough that they're going to keep the conversation going. As Chinese state media confirmed earlier today that Chinese President Xi Jinping will accept President Trump's invitation to come to the U.S. this fall. Because beyond that, a lot of the deliverables, as you're outlining, didn't have that many firm details. Yes, we got the Boeing deal. In fact, we can confirm that Boeing officials were still here on the ground in Beijing today, meeting with top economic officials in an apparent good sign for that deal. But we didn't see many details around agricultural purchases, for one example, or energy products, as President Trump had pledged that there were conversations around these items. In fact, there had been an expectation, right, that we could even see some movement on NVIDIA's H200 chips, considering that NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang last minute attended this summit. President Trump did say that they spoke about those chips behind closed doors, but ultimately not about whether China would be a buyer, allow companies to buy those chips, saying that instead China wants to develop them on their own. So still a lot of questions here, but it is clear that the conversation is going to continue.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live in Beijing for us. Great work throughout the last several days, Tyler. Thank you so much. And we want to go live to Capitol Hill next as we're preparing to be joined by Republican Congressman Vince Fong of California. And I want to begin with the issue of Taiwan. As Tyler was just talking about some of the tension that existed in the remarks around Taiwan here, let's listen to how President Trump characterized what she asked of him and what his response was earlier.
He doesn't want to see a movement for independence. He says, look, we've had it for thousands of years, and then at a certain period of time it left, and we were going to get it back. They had the Korean War, a lot of things happened, and all this. But on Taiwan, he feels very strongly. I made no commitment either way.
On Taiwan, he feels very strongly, I made no commitment either way. And that's where we bring in now Congressman Vince Fong, as I mentioned, representing California's 20th district, the Republican joining us live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, welcome. The president also apparently has not decided whether or not to commit to a $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan. He suggested he will be making a decision about that soon, knowing, of course, Congress has already greenlit that sale. Do you hope that he decides to move forward?
Well, this is certainly going to be a flashpoint that will continue on to the future. But yes, I mean, we need to support Taiwan. You see the great powers competition that the United States is engaged with China. China is trying to dominate and outcompete America in a variety of areas, whether it's AI, whether it's in technology, quantum, whether it's on space. You look at biotech as well, robotics, and so we are going to have to deal with this relationship for the long term. But we need to support Taiwan, and it's going to be a continuous challenge for us as a country.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out, Congressman, we appreciate your joining us here. If anything has actually changed, we've heard some tough rhetoric over the past couple of days, but should America's friends in Taiwan be more worried today than they were before this summit?
I don't think so. I mean, certainly, look, the president is going to China in a position of strength. Again, as I've said before, China, the rise of China and the great powers competition. I mean, this is going to be the issue that will dominate our relationship and the global relationships across the world when it comes to stability for the next century. And so we are going to have to confront this challenge head on. The president is certainly tackling that. He is going to China. He is confronting the president. He is going to negotiate. He is going to talk. He is going to address these issues forthrightly and bring them to the forefront. I mean, we can't hide from the fact that this is going to be an issue that we're confronting. But at the end of the day, we have a president now that is willing to address it immediately with a sense of urgency.
Well, and it's understood, Congressman, that just the act of talking, of participating in a summit like this is important in and of itself. But is the president walking away with enough firm in hand? Where are all the deals that we expected to come from this? The commitments to China that China we thought might make when it comes to purchases of U.S. products. Are you disappointed?
No, I mean, look, this is the first of many conversations and many interactions between the United States and China. The president is going in with his eyes wide open. Again, China is not our friend. And so when we look at the competition that we're engaged in, look, they're stealing our IP. They're terrible on human rights. When you look at the challenges right now in cybersecurity, we just had a briefing on Mythos and the vulnerabilities that it has exposed. China is actively trying to develop those same AI platforms to exploit our vulnerabilities. When you look at commercial space, they are trying to be dominant in that arena. You look at emerging technology, biotechnology. 80% are probably the reagents and the things that make our medical devices and our pharmaceutical products come from China. I mean, think about this: if we were back in during the Cold War, we would never allow the Soviet Union to make 70 to 80% of the things that make our economy function. Fast forward to today. China does make 70 to 80% of the things that make our economy function. So the president is trying to put an industrial policy together. He is trying to rebalance the relationship, ensure that America is strong in a variety of industries. This is going to be an important thing, and the president is leading from the front.
What do you make of some of the analysis today from Bloomberg? A paltry set of deliverables underscoring the rushed and chaotic planning for the trip as he grappled with the Iran war and a range of domestic issues. Axios, nearly every force shaping U.S.-China relations is in fact pulling them apart. And the Washington Post, in pageantry and politics, China summit yields Xi's goal, equal footing with the U.S. It's that last point I want to ask you about, Congressman, the image of these two superpowers on similar footing, what the president referred to as the G2 in an interview yesterday, seems to favor China, does it not?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that's a lot of rhetoric. We're going to look at the specifics, but again, the president is leading. I mean, you look at the previous administration and the administrations before that. I mean, we are dealing and confronting a real challenge. We are in a great powers competition. I mean, as I said before, China is going to be the challenge. They could either be a force for good in partnership with us, or they could be a force for instability. And so this is something that our eyes are wide open when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to the entire Indo-PACOM region, when it comes to our competition in a variety of industries. I mean, we have to lead. And when you look at the president's investments in bringing back manufacturing, when you look at the use of tariffs to expand expand our leverage, when you look at the investments when it comes to hardening our supply chain, when bringing back critical minerals to the United States, when you look at our leadership in AI, all of this is to confront the growing threat that China poses to us.
Congressman, finally, as you have a seat on the Transportation Committee, I'd love to ask you, as we consider another geopolitical challenge the U.S. is facing, it's obviously how to extract ourselves from the conflict with Iran and how to get the Strait of Hormuz back open and energy flowing out of the Middle East once again. The president has floated an idea of a federal gas tax holiday. Do you support it, knowing it could mean a hit in the fund that funds so much of our critical transit infrastructure?
Well, we're looking at it. I mean, certainly affordability is probably the top issue facing Americans right now. Gas prices, number one. In California, gas prices has surpassed $6. As someone who advocated for suspension of the state gas tax, we should look at the suspension of the federal gas tax, but it's not a permanent solution. We certainly have to look for ways to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent. So we're looking at every single angle to fund our roads, but we have to bring back the price of gasoline. The solution to the price to reducing the price of gasoline is to expand supply, to invest in energy infrastructure, to expand our refining capacity. These are the things that President Trump is doing. Contrast President Trump's energy policy to the policy of Gavin Newsom. No question, Gavin Newsom has made California weaker and more vulnerable. We cannot follow down that path. We need to follow President Trump's lead in expanding energy production. That is the long-term solution to reducing gas prices and making America energy secure.
Congressman, it's great to have you. Thanks for being part of our conversation today with us live from Capitol Hill. Congressman Vince Fong, California's 20th district, as we assemble our political panel for their take on what we just heard. Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis is with us, Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital, alongside Democratic strategist Jim Kessler from Third Way. Jim, what do you think about that response on a gas tax holiday? It doesn't appear the leadership is in favor on Capitol Hill. Does this see the light of day?
It's hard to say. Gas this time last year was $3.19 a gallon. Right now it's $4.55 a gallon. And it is purely because a war of choice in Iran that was a bad idea, it's going to take months and months, perhaps years longer than anyone anticipated, and it's not going to achieve its results. So, gas tax, I believe, is 18 cents. And, that would be nice to go from $4.55 to $4.37. It would drain our resources in which we fund roads and bridges. But, this is a problem of Donald Trump's making, and frankly, nobody else.
Well, Rick, I know that you see the political opportunity for basically anyone who's in elected office right now to pursue a federal gas tax holiday. My question is, how quickly do you think it realistically could happen? How quickly would it need to happen to have the desired effect?
Yeah, I know I disagree with many economists who say it's bad policy, but it's good politics. And the reality is that Congress has done little to help support the Americans who feel the pinch on cost of living, and this is one area that they can at least side with the American public. The reality is that getting, the feeling of it is the feeling of action, not the feeling at the pump. I mean, Americans are never really going to be impacted politically by a couple cents at the gallon coming down. But if they see Washington at least making an effort to try and take over their priorities of cost of living, of affordability, and doing something about it, it can soothe what is right now a pretty grumpy, angry consumer.
All right, Rick Davis and Jim Kessler will be back with us for more in just a few moments as we continue on here on Balance of Power. We'll also be bringing you a taste of what will be on Wall Street Week this evening. Bloomberg's David Weston is going to join us just straight ahead right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got a steep sell-off for the U.S. equity market with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all falling. Yes, a down day for the S&P 500 index, retreating from a record. We are on track, though, for another winning week for the S&P. Here's where we stand. S&P currently at 7440, down 60, drop there of 0.8%. A sell-off in global bonds is halting a rally in stocks. There is concern intensifying that central banks will be forced to tighten policy policy to keep inflation in check. The Dow back below 50,000, down 399 now, down 0.8%. The Nasdaq Composite Index and Nasdaq 100 Index are both down by 1%. The VIX back below 18 now with a 10-year 4.58%, the 2-year 4.07%, the 30-year 5.11%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil, $105 a barrel, up 3.8%. Brent, the global benchmark, at 109.11, up now by just about 3.2%. Round 2 of the PGA Championship underway in Newtown in Pennsylvania. At last check, South Africa's Aldrich Potgieter sits atop the leaderboard at 4 under par. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, many thanks as we keep our eyes on President Trump returning to the United States from a 3-day summit in China and exactly what the United States has to show for it. When we consider the analysis at Bloomberg News, the paltry set of deliverables underscored the rushed and chaotic planning for the trip as he grappled with the Iran war and a range of domestic issues. The market clearly not getting a lift out of what we heard even yesterday. Shares of Boeing and GE Aerospace were lower on disappointment over a deal to sell jets to China. Both of those stocks are lower again today. And of course, oil prices have resumed their climb because, well, we haven't been talking about it all day. The Strait of Hormuz, yes, remains closed, and it appears that China will not be helping us reopen it. David Weston joins us now live from World Headquarters in New York, of course, the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, who's delving into the matter that the president was discussing, many of the matters with President Xi following this summit, what it means for the world's 2 biggest economies. And David, it's great to see you. That Bloomberg News analysis may be a bit between the eyes, but there is something to be said for what appears to be the lack of advance, the lack of agreements before these 2 gentlemen sat down.
Yeah, it's interesting, Joe. I'm not sure exactly what we expected, what the markets expected, how much they expected. We had talked to people beforehand who said, don't expect too much coming out of this. The goal might just be stability. I mean, if you remember, it wasn't that long ago, we were at daggers drawn over a thing like rare earths. At least they weren't fighting over those. I mean, President Xi wasn't threatening things. So I'm not sure exactly what we expected to come out of this, but I think it's fair to say that there were no big breakthroughs, at least from the United States point of view.
Well, so if there was no big breakthrough, David, no big fundamental changes, what does this mean for an investor who already has had to navigate previous trade wars with China, try to figure out how to make decisions around this relationship in the 2 largest economies?
As always, there's a short term, Kailey, and there's a longer term. In the short term, I'm not sure how much difference it makes. It may stabilize things. We're not increasing our tariffs. Maybe they'll buy some more soybeans, buy some more Boeing planes, although not as many as we would hope for. But then there's the larger, longer term issues about exactly what happened. And although there were no breakthroughs, there might have been some fundamental changes just in the nature of the relationship between the United States and China. We see a China that is more assertive, certainly, as you saw, when President Xi came out of the box, according to their readout, starting with Taiwan. I mean, that was not a shy move on his part. And so we sat down with Ray Dalio, who, as you know, is a student of China, spent more than 30 years going there. He was there just within the last couple of weeks meeting with leadership in advance of the summit to get their perspective. And it was really important, at least for me, that Ray has a different perspective on how the Chinese regard it. We think of it as a zero-sum game. Are we up? Are we down? They have a longer-term view based on their history that basically has to do with a tribute system, is the way Ray put it. This is part of what Ray had to say.
So this tribute system is a hierarchical system. It recognizes that there are differences in power and that the important thing in dealing with other countries is how it affects you in your trade and your safety. And so we're now entering, I think, in their view, a period in which there will be a tribute system type of arrangement in which the relative powers are what matter. Okay, we don't have a world court that's going to resolve our problems and so on. So it's a relative power question. The desire is not to take over and conquer. They view that as a Mediterranean concept. But it is to have your family well, your country well, and then to operate with the rest of the world where there's the recognition of relative powers. Therefore, the United States, and there are comparable relative powers. I think they think the United States is declining and that they are sort of winning that relative war. But also in the region, there's the recognition, in their view, that there is an environment where the countries in the region have to recognize and respect that power. And so now you're seeing that happen.
Whoever is winning or losing, in terms of that relative power that Ray is talking about, let me give you one statistic that I find interesting. When President Trump last went to China, Chinese GDP was something like 25 or 30% of U.S. GDP. Now it is 60%. So in terms of relative power, economic power, there's no question, but there's a big shift. And President Xi is really aware of that as he's seeing it. And then we can conclude for ourselves whether President Xi thought, in fact, President Trump was coming to pay tribute, as it were.
It's a really nuanced view, and it's important that you bring it to us here, David. Of course, balance of power is followed by Bloomberg Wall Street Week, and we'd love to know what else you have in store tonight.
Well, we have more China, which is actually the race over energy for AI. We have Hank Paulson on, who's concerned about that, as well as Nick Burns, whom you know well, former ambassador there, because China is really advancing quickly in power on renewables as we've cut back on renewables. And then we've got a favorite for us all, which is taxation, and particularly Miriam Mamdani's battle with Ken Griffin over that so-called pied-à-terre tax, and whether that really is going to make a lot of difference to New York City. So we talk about that as well, near and dear to the hearts of all of our audience, I suspect.
God knows.
Indeed. We're looking forward to the show. David Weston, host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, which you can catch at 6 p.m. Eastern time on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much, as always. And absolutely fascinating to hear from Ray Dalio about this concept of relative power when it comes to the U.S. and China, because this is also something we explored in an interview on Balance of Power last night with Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, who was also talking about the power dynamics at play here. He doesn't think that they favored President Trump. Listen.
The videography and the symbolism has been more interesting. This is the first time since World War II where a president has been in a room and it wasn't clear who the most powerful person in that room was. And that is a statement about how badly this president has mishandled his strategic calculations. He picked a trade war with China last year, lost it. Picked a kinetic war with Iran this year, lost it. And now his loss of power and prestige has been evident by the fact that he is in a room with a bunch of tech titans and Xi Jinping, and arguably all of them actually have more power and influence than he does over the grand current events that are dictating American life right now.
Let's see what our panel thinks about that as we welcome back Republican strategist and Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis and Democratic strategist Jim Kessler of Third Way. Rick, I would love to know what you think of Congressman Auchincloss's remarks there, the suggestion that Trump was potentially the weakest player in this room.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think that it's very easy to create a scenario where Trump himself as an individual, for whatever reason, came out of this looking weaker. And some of the pandering that he did to President Xi may actually give people the impression that he was kowtowing, to use a Chinese phrase. The reality is his presidency has probably been seen as the most powerful execution of American power, both economic and militarily in our lifetime. And it has shown the degree to which the United States can hold sway over markets and security around the world. China has never exerted that kind of financial and militaristic influence around the world. They have been choosing a different path to do that, and so I don't buy the argument that somehow the United States is weaker because Trump appeared weak.
Joe Biden's China director on the National Security Council echoes the sentiment of Jake Auchincloss, Jim Kessler, saying Xi has done something Chinese leaders have been working toward for decades, bringing an American president to Beijing as an undisputed peer. Do you agree?
I do agree with that. And look, I think there's a dichotomy here because on the one hand, I agree with Rick Davis in that Donald Trump does project power. America has been projecting power clearly, like Venezuela, other places, throwing its weight around. On the other hand, and the Bloomberg article you cite gets it exactly right, Xi Jinping was prepared and Donald Trump was not prepared. And this summit was a disaster for America. And Xi Jinping just laid the wood on him right away on Taiwan and Donald Trump gave the wrong answer on it. And, you know, this is a situation like you want stability, but you don't want stability on China's terms. And look, I think the reality here is Donald Trump doesn't really care about Taiwan. He said this in August of 2024, that it's 9,000 miles away and it's only 100 miles away from China. And, you know, he's given indications that he doesn't really care. Well, that's a major change in the balance of power in that region. And with China, which is fair enough, China is, and the United States, we are the G2. And we are competitors, and we don't want to be at war with China, but we also don't want to boost them. And I think this summit was a disaster for the United States.
Well, as we hear Jim say that the president didn't give the right answer on Taiwan, the president said he didn't give an answer. He wasn't committal either way. But is that telling in and of itself?
Yeah, why not just restate the same policy the U.S. has had for decades? And by the way, which would have been a real slap in the face to Xi, because that's the last thing he wants to hear from an American president. And I agree with Jim in that this was a really bad summit. It doesn't reflect on my view of the power of the world, power of the United States around the world, but this was a poorly planned, poorly executed summit on our behalf. Fundamentally, if an American president comes to your country, it should be pre-negotiated well in advance what's going to come out of that, because the power and the prestige of the United States going to Beijing is an important and symbolic measure that only we can bestow on a country like China. China coming here, nobody's really going to care. But when a president of the United States goes to Beijing, all the world's eyes are upon it. And in this case, it really wasn't very well planned. I don't even know why the president was there, because there was no perceived goal other than stability. We had stability before he went there. In fact, today, I would say there are a lot of people scratching their head wondering what message did Xi get from Trump being there unprepared.
Wow. I think they agreed on a lot here, actually.
Yeah.
Rick Davis and Jim Kessler, really fascinating. Thank you both for the insights and a great panel. Rick, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, a Republican strategist. Jim Kessler, Democratic strategist from Third Way. We've got an important conversation ahead for you. I want you to stay right where you are with Bloomberg TV and radio. It's the last day for Jay Powell as chair of the Federal Reserve. And Kailey, we have the perfect voice for the occasion.
Yeah, Lael Brainard will be joining us, of course, former Fed vice chair and former director of the National Economic Council during the Biden administration. Wonder what she makes of the moves we're seeing in the bond market today as well. That's next here on Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all very much in the red. Stocks are falling as inflation jitters lift bond yields. Right now, the S&P under 7,500. You recall it closed at a record yesterday. We are on track for a winning week, but right now looking at losses with the S&P down 0.7%, lower by 53 points. The Dow back below 50,000, 49,641 on the Dow, down 0.8%. NASDAQ Composite Index also down by 0.8%. NASDAQ and the NASDAQ 100 Index are both retreating from records. The VIX right below 18 right now. The 10-year, 4.58%. We've got the 2-year currently yielding 4.07%, with the 30-year at 5.12%. Gold is down $89 the ounce to $45.62, down 1.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude right around 105 a barrel. WTI up 3.9%. Brent crude 109.13 barrel of Brent, up now by just about 3.2%. Just getting word that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission plans to cut employer data reports on race and gender, that according to B-Law. Also, word of job cuts at Starbucks, the coffee chain cutting an additional 300 corporate jobs, its largest move to hit cost reduction targets. And Papa John's international shares are advancing, up by 6.2%, after Reuters reported that the investment firm Earth Capital is working with the pizza chain's largest American franchisee, to take control of the company and take the company private. Recapping, S&P down 58 right now, down 0.8%. The 10-year, 4.58%. Also, we've got the 30-year at 5.12%. Round 2 of the PGA Championship underway in Newtown in Pennsylvania. At last check, South Africa's 21-year-old Aldrich Potgieter sits atop the leaderboard at 4 under par. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, checking on the markets for us. Thank you so much. And what a story the bond market in particular seems to be telling today. As Charlie was running you through upward pressure that we are seeing, yields up about 10 basis points on the 10-year. The 2-year yield, as Charlie mentioned, back above 4%. The short end of the curve is not signaling that it expects easier monetary policy to be coming anytime soon. In fact, there's a live conversation as to whether or not the Federal Reserve is going to find itself in a position in the not-so-distant future where it has to consider tightening policy and hiking rates once again, even though clearly that is not what President Trump has been pushing for, not what he is hoping that his new Fed chair, Kevin Warsh, will deliver. Because yes, it will be Chair Warsh, no longer Chair Powell. Today is the last day of Jerome Powell's term on top of the Fed, and what a time he has had, from a few inflationary events like a trade war, COVID and the emergence from the pandemic, the shock emanating from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the whole story around transitory inflation, and then, of course, a whole separate story unrelated to the economy itself around the renovation of the Fed's building here in Washington and the pursuit of him as a result. Let's just get a recap of the chairmanship that was Powell's.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the faith that you have shown in me through this nomination. The spread of the coronavirus has brought new challenges and risks. In response, we have eased the stance of monetary policy to provide some more support to the economy. The effect on inflation will be neither particularly large nor persistent. We expect that they'll be transitory or temporary. The word transitory has different meanings to different people. I think it's probably a good time to retire that word.
It looks like it's about 3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. After my term as chair ends on May 15, I will continue to serve as a governor for a period of time to be determined. I plan to keep a low profile as a governor. I won't see you next time.
All right, hold your hard hats. We're joined by an important voice on this final day of Mr. Powell's tenure as chair, and that would be none other than Lael Brainard, as we told you. With us in studio, the former director, National Economic Council in the Biden administration, former vice chair, Federal Reserve, now at Georgetown. It's wonderful to have you with us here, and we have many questions about Jay Powell's tenure, your firsthand experience, but I do have to start with what's happening here in the bond market. This is overwhelming the stock market today. Is this everything about the PPI, CPI we saw this week? Is it about the concern of it getting worse because of a closed Strait of Hormuz, or is there more going on here?
Well, I think there are a number of things going on. Obviously, there's some carryover from overseas where the UK government dynamics are carrying over into the U.S. at the very long end. But as you say, both CPI coming in very hot and PPI, input prices, freight, suggesting that we're going to see additional pressures, upward pressures on consumer inflation in the months ahead. And of course, really very few people expect the Strait of Hormuz to be open and that oil to be moving into global markets, certainly not before the end of May, probably not well into the summer. And that means that as Kevin Warsh enters the Fed, it is a inflationary set of risks that he has to contend with.
Well, therefore making it very difficult to pursue rate cuts. But how high is the bar in your mind to actually tighten policy further? How hard would it be to hike rates, knowing that this also could ripple down and have a potentially negative growth impact?
Well, I think the day one job for Kevin Warsh walking into the Federal Reserve is to move the Fed away from the easing bias that has now been in place since late last year. It's no longer appropriate. We've had a massive inflationary shock. It's piling on top of earlier inflationary shocks, and we're seeing that core PC inflation is moving up, likely to come in around 3.3%. So the first business for Kevin Warsh is to actually move away from that easing bias. And of course, that's exactly the reverse of the reason the president gave for trying so hard to replace Jay Powell.
I was taken by your op-ed in the FT, in which you talk about inflation pressures in the future. When people expect inflation to persist, you write, it tends to change pricing behavior by businesses, and a temporary shock becomes a persistent one. You know about this because you've lived it. What does it mean for the second half of this year?
Well, I think we started to see some of that in the PPI data with margins going up.
Okay.
And that is the kind of behavior when consumers expect gas prices to keep going up, then those gas station margins can go up as well. We are seeing it in freight costs. Everything is going to be affected by diesel, packaging costs for food. So we still have some inflationary pressure coming for the consumer in the months ahead. And when I talk to consumers, and you can see it in the consumer surveys, their inflation expectations have jumped much higher, but they also just are very resigned to prices never coming back down. So they say, I hear about tariff refunds. I'm never going to see those refunds in lower prices. I see gas prices going up. When am I actually going to see some relief? So I think that concern about a series of supply shocks really leading into changing inflation expectations is one that the Fed has to show they're taking seriously.
Yeah. Well, and of course, for consumers, if your wages are not keeping up with this, it feeds into the sentiment downdraft we have been experiencing. We saw that borne out in the CPI with wages being outpaced by inflation for the first time in 3 years. When do you expect that this starts to have a greater impact on the economy itself, on consumer demand overall, on demand for labor as the Fed contends with the other part of its dual mandate?
Well, what's interesting, as you said, average hourly earnings actually negative for the first time in a very long time this month. And it does affect consumers on the lower end. So what we are seeing, I think, with consumers on the lower end, I hear from them that they are using, where they have access to credit, they're using credit more. They're running down their buffers. When you look at those overall retail sales numbers, though, those were very strong, I would say, given where we are with oil prices. And that just speaks to the K-shaped economy, the very top of the consumer income kind of distribution, really driving that ongoing uplift to consumption. So that's why we're seeing, I think, this big vibe chasm, consumer sentiment being extremely negative, but consumers continuing to power growth.
Speak to the significance of this day for Jay Powell. I don't know what happens inside the Fed on a chair's last day. Are there fireworks? Is there a cake? We're wondering. Maybe there's an official handling of the gavel. But as we recall the stylings of Jay Powell and the challenges he faced in dealing with this administration, will the relationship between the chair and the president ever be the same again?
Well, I think that will be the biggest legacy of Chair Jerome Powell, is just the integrity with which he led this institution and really protected its independence during a time when the president mounted a series of unprecedented actions, firing a governor, undertaking a criminal investigation. So I think the chair's legacy is really going to be around preserving the independence of the Federal Reserve. And I think he actually gives Kevin Warsh a much stronger position to start from than might have been the case otherwise.
But what does it do to Kevin Warsh's starting position that Chairman Powell's still going to be hanging around, not as chair, but as a governor? He says he wants to keep a low profile, but what impact do you expect that will have inside the Fed?
Well, I certainly know from working with Chair Powell when he was Governor Powell that he's very constructive. As he said, he will be low profile. I really expect that to be the case. So I imagine, and he of course worked with Governor Kevin Warsh, I expect that they'll establish a good working relationship. What it means, of course, is that the consistent dissenter, the CEA chair for President Trump, Stephen Myron, is rotating off, at least for the time being. And so that actually makes Kevin Warsh's job a little bit easier if, in fact, he decides he is going to move away from that easing bias and recognize there may be two-sided risks to rates.
Speak about the cultural shift inside the Fed when a new chair shows up. This is obviously a very close group of people. You go behind closed doors and make very difficult decisions, but I'm sure that there's a camaraderie there and a style that's impacted by a new person holding the gavel.
Well, the staff are absolute professionals. I mean, these are people who have deep expertise, but they understand that they are providing advice and depth. But the policymakers, the chair, is leading on policy. And so they will offer up that same sage advice, uncolored by their own views, to the incoming chair. And similarly, I think board members and the regional presidents tend to be very serious. They take the data very seriously. You've heard how they're parsing the data right now, how they themselves are shifting, but they are also very collegial.
Well, of course, a lot of conversations do happen behind closed doors, but we also hear frequently from Fed governors or officials on the FOMC, and it seems Kevin Warsh thinks it maybe is too frequent, at least judging by his testimony in his confirmation hearing, not even just in terms of speeches and the like, but in putting out a summary of economic projections, for example. I wonder what you think we might expect in terms of a shift in the, at the very least, amount of guidance that financial markets are given by the Fed.
It is possible, given that he will now be making the recommendations on the statement and will also be making recommendations on what kinds of communications the committee's making. There are a number of things he could do. He could decide to put forward a statement that doesn't include forward guidance at all. He could decide to drop his press conferences or move to every second press conference. He could guide the committee over time to decide to no longer issue summaries of economic projections. So those are all things that he could do. The question mark. Yeah, so I think that is the question mark if in fact he wants to be leading the Fed and providing that voice that is the kind of preeminent voice on Fed policy. He may find that he wants some of those tools. And in particular, the every meeting press conference has raised the chair's voice relative to other members.
We all remember trying to gauge what Alan Greenspan was going to say based on how fat his briefcase was. We would have paid good money for a news conference back then. Do you expect that regular news conferences will follow each meeting?
I think that was one of the question marks that his testimony left open. What he won't be able to change is the number of times that the regional presidents and board members speak. And so it would be, I think, to his disadvantage to retreat from the field and leave the markets to interpret based on other members of the committee alone.
All right, so great to have you, the former vice chair of the Fed and former director of the National Economic Council in the Biden administration, Lael Brainard, here with us on Balance of Power. Thank you so much. And of course, we'll have more in the late edition at 5 p.m. right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.